Something happened last night that you may never have expected. Something quiet happened behind the scenes, somewhere you could not see, involving a person connected to a chapter your soulmate once thought was completely finished. It may have looked like an ordinary dinner from the outside. A table. A conversation. A few familiar faces. A night that seemed completely normal. But sometimes, what looks ordinary on the surface carries a truth that changes everything underneath, and this message is finding you because there is something your heart needs to understand. You do not need to chase an explanation. You do not need to force an answer. You do not need to become obsessed with what someone else may have said, done, or remembered. There are moments in life when clarity arrives without being invited. There are moments when the past suddenly crosses paths with the present, not to reopen an old door, but to reveal why that door needed to close in the first place. Last night may have been one of those moments. Your soulmate's ex may have sat across from them, or perhaps their name came up during a conversation, or perhaps someone connected to that old relationship unexpectedly appeared at the dinner. Maybe the meeting was planned. Maybe it happened because circumstances simply brought people together. But whatever the reason, something about the conversation forced your soulmate to look backward for a moment. And when they looked backward, they realized something they had not fully understood before. The past did not feel like home anymore. That realization can be powerful, because sometimes you do not recognize how far you have traveled until you briefly stand beside something that once represented where you came from. Imagine the atmosphere. The evening is moving normally. People are talking. Plates are being placed on the table. Someone laughs at something that is not even that funny. There are pauses between conversations. There is music somewhere in the background. The outside world continues as usual. But inside your soulmate's mind, something is changing. They are listening to words from a person who once knew them differently. Someone who knew an older version of them. Someone who remembers mistakes you never witnessed. Someone who may remember dreams your soulmate once had before life changed them. And suddenly, your soulmate is comparing the person they were with the person they are becoming. That comparison is where the surprise begins, because they realize they are no longer the same person. The things that once impressed them may no longer impress them. The conversations that once mattered may now feel empty. The emotional patterns they once tolerated may now feel exhausting, and perhaps most importantly, the kind of connection they once accepted may no longer satisfy the deeper part of their heart. There is something different about you. Maybe you did not even realize it. Maybe you have wondered why this connection feels different from other relationships, friendships, or encounters you have experienced. Maybe you have questioned why someone can remain in your thoughts even when there has been distance. Maybe you have wondered why certain moments seem to bring their memory back. But there is a reason the heart sometimes remembers what the mind tries to organize. Not every meaningful connection arrives with immediate certainty. Some arrive quietly. Some grow through time. Some become meaningful because they awaken something inside you that you had forgotten existed. And sometimes, the most important realization does not happen when two people are together. It happens when one person is alone after being reminded of what they truly want. That may have happened last night. The dinner may have started casually, but eventually the conversation became more personal. Perhaps the ex asked questions. Perhaps they talked about the past. Perhaps someone mentioned relationships. Perhaps they discussed what has changed. Perhaps the ex tried to understand why. Your soulmate seems different now. Maybe they noticed something. Maybe they sensed that your soulmate's attention was no longer emotionally anchored in that old chapter, and perhaps that was uncomfortable. Because there is a strange moment that happens when someone realizes they no longer have the same place in another person's heart. It can be difficult to accept, especially when they remember how things used to be. But the truth is, people grow, people change, people learn, and sometimes two people who once shared a chapter eventually discover that they were never meant to write the entire story together. The dinner may have reminded your soulmate of that, not because the ex was necessarily a bad person, not because the past was meaningless, but because the past served its purpose. It taught something, it revealed something, it prepared something, and now your soulmate may be looking at their life differently. They may be asking themselves questions they avoided before. What kind of relationship do I actually want? What kind of person makes me feel understood? Where do I feel peaceful? Who brings out the best version of me? What am I afraid to admit? And perhaps the most important question of all, why do I keep thinking about you? That question can be difficult to escape, because you may represent something they cannot easily explain. You may represent emotional safety. You may represent a future they have not yet had the courage to imagine. You may represent the possibility of something deeper than what they experienced before, and that is why the dinner matters in this spiritual message. Not because you need to believe every detail literally, but because it symbolizes something important. The past is being compared with the possibility of the future, and the future is beginning to look different. There may have been a moment during that dinner when your soulmate became unusually quiet. Maybe someone asked them a question and they took longer than expected to answer. Maybe they looked away. Maybe they smiled politely. Maybe they changed the subject. Maybe they realized they were thinking about you, not because someone told them to, not because they were trying to, but because your memory appeared naturally. That is what happens when something becomes emotionally significant. You can be sitting at a table with people from yesterday while your heart is thinking about tomorrow, and perhaps that is exactly what happened. The ex may have talked about old memories, a familiar restaurant, a mutual friend, a trip, an inside joke, a moment from years ago, and your soulmate may have listened, remembering everything. But the strange thing is that remembering the past did not necessarily make them want to return to it. Instead, it may have made them realize how much they have changed. They may have thought, I don't want that anymore. I want something different. I want something real. I want something peaceful. I want someone who understands who I am becoming instead of constantly pulling me back toward who I used to be. And perhaps that thought led directly to you. That is the surprising part. The dinner may have been about the past, but emotionally, it could have pointed your soulmate toward the future. You there is something deeply powerful about realizing what you want after experiencing what you do not want. Sometimes clarity comes through contrast. You recognize peace because you have experienced chaos. You recognize honesty because you have experienced confusion. You recognize consistency because you have experienced uncertainty. You recognize genuine affection because you have experienced attention that came with conditions, and perhaps your soulmate is beginning to understand the difference. Maybe before, they did not know what they were looking for. Maybe they thought attraction was enough. Maybe they believed history automatically meant compatibility. Maybe they confused familiarity with love. But life teaches, experience teaches, distance teaches, and sometimes one unexpected conversation teaches more than years of avoiding the truth. Last night may have exposed that truth. Perhaps the ex said something that sounded harmless but revealed more than they intended. Maybe they asked whether your soulmate was seeing anyone. Maybe they wondered whether someone special had entered their life. Maybe they noticed your soulmate's reaction to the subject. Maybe they asked why your soulmate seemed distracted. And perhaps your soulmate did not give a direct answer. Sometimes silence says more than a long explanation. Sometimes a person's face changes before their words do. Sometimes the heart answers before the mouth has decided what to say, and perhaps your soulmate's heart answered with your name, even if they did not speak it aloud, even if nobody at that table heard it. The thought may have been there. You? Why you? Why now? Why does this person keep returning to my thoughts? Why? Does the idea of a future with them feel different? Why did I not understand this earlier? Those questions can create a storm inside someone, especially someone who has been trying to remain emotionally controlled. Perhaps your soulmate has been telling themselves they should wait. Perhaps they have been trying to act casual. Perhaps they have been pretending that everything is simple. But feelings rarely remain simple when they become meaningful. There comes a point when avoidance becomes more exhausting than honesty. And maybe your soulmate is approaching that point. The dinner may have shown them something they could no longer ignore. Maybe they realize that their ex knows their past, but you may understand their present. That distinction matters. Someone can know your history without understanding your heart. Someone can remember who you were without recognizing who you are becoming. Someone can have shared memories with you without being the person you want beside you in the future. And perhaps your soulmate finally understands this. The ex belongs to a chapter. You belong to a possibility. And possibilities can be frightening. Because the past is familiar, the future requires courage. Choosing something new means admitting that the old way was not enough. It means accepting vulnerability. It means risking rejection. It means saying something that could change everything. Perhaps your soulmate is afraid of that. Maybe they are afraid you do not feel the same. Maybe they are worried they waited too long. Maybe they wonder whether you have already moved on. Maybe they have watched you become stronger and assumed you no longer need them. Maybe they have imagined you with someone else and felt a pang of regret. But regret can become a teacher, and last night may have taught them something important. If they keep waiting for the perfect moment may never come. Sometimes you have to create the courage yourself. Sometimes you have to stop asking whether everything is perfectly aligned and simply tell the truth. maybe that is the emotional shift beginning now, not necessarily an instant confession, not necessarily a dramatic event, but an internal decision, a decision to stop running from what matters, and perhaps that decision began at a dinner that seemed completely ordinary. There is another possibility worth considering. Maybe the ex did not want to reconnect romantically at all. Maybe the dinner was simply an unexpected meeting between two people who once shared something meaningful, and that makes the story even more interesting, because your soulmate may have discovered that there was no emotional spark anymore, no longing, no desire to return. Only gratitude for what was and acceptance of what is. That realization can be surprisingly peaceful. They may have looked across the table and thought, I once wanted this, I once believed this was my future, but I am not that person anymore, and maybe that realization created space in their heart. Space for something new, space for you. Perhaps the ex noticed, perhaps they saw the difference in your soulmate's energy. Perhaps they realized that your soulmate was no longer emotionally available to that old story. Maybe they even asked, "Are you happy now?" And perhaps your soulmate did not answer immediately, because the honest answer required them to think about what happiness actually means. Happiness is not always excitement. Sometimes it is peace, sometimes it is being understood, sometimes it is being able to speak without fear, sometimes it is knowing that you do not have to perform to earn someone's affection, sometimes happiness is simply feeling that you can be yourself. And perhaps when your soulmate thought about that, they thought of you. Maybe they remembered a conversation, a small moment, something you said, something you did, a look, a laugh, a message, a moment when you made them feel seen. Those tiny memories can become surprisingly powerful, because meaningful connections are not always built from dramatic moments. Sometimes they are built from the smallest details, the way someone listens, the way they remember, the way they encourage you, the way they make ordinary moments feel significant. Maybe your soulmate remembers those things. Maybe they have remembered them more often than you realize, and perhaps last night made those memories stronger. The dinner could have become a mirror. The ex represented who they were, you represented who they could become, and standing between those two images was a choice. Not necessarily a choice they announced, not necessarily a choice they made publicly, but an emotional choice, a quiet realization, a private truth. I cannot keep living according to the past. That sentence can change everything. Because once someone recognizes that they have outgrown an old emotional pattern, returning to it becomes harder. The familiar may still feel comfortable, but comfortable does not always mean correct. Sometimes the familiar is simply familiar, and the unknown can be where growth begins. Perhaps your soulmate is standing at that threshold now, 1 foot in the past, 1 foot toward something new, and perhaps you are part of that new chapter. But there is something you must remember. Do not put your life on pause waiting for another person to become ready. Your purpose is not to sit still while someone else decides what they want. Your life is happening now. Your growth is happening now. Your future is being shaped now. If this connection is meant to become something meaningful, it should not require you to abandon yourself. You do not need to chase. You do not need to prove your worth. You do not need to compete with an ex. You do not need to investigate every detail of last night's dinner. You do not need to compare yourself with anyone. The deeper message is about self-respect. If someone chooses you, let them choose you clearly. If someone wants to speak, let them speak. If someone wants to build something real, let their actions demonstrate it. You deserve clarity. You deserve respect. You deserve a connection that does not leave you constantly guessing. And perhaps that is exactly what your soulmate is beginning to understand. Maybe their past taught them what confusion feels like. Maybe their experiences taught them what inconsistency feels like. Maybe they now understand that love cannot survive on assumptions alone. Love requires communication. Love requires honesty. Love requires effort. Love requires two people willing to show up. Perhaps the dinner reminded them of everything they once tolerated, and maybe they realized they do not want to repeat those patterns. That is growth. That is maturity. That is transformation. And sometimes transformation happens quietly. Nobody applauds. Nobody notices. There is no announcement. A person simply wakes up one day and realizes, I want better, I want healthier, I want real, and perhaps your soulmate is arriving at that realization. Maybe they are looking at their life and seeing the consequences of their choices. Maybe they are wondering what would happen if they stopped hiding. What would happen if they reached out? What would happen if they told you the truth? What would happen if you did not respond the way they hoped? Fear may be present, but courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is deciding that the truth is worth the risk. And perhaps last night gave your soulmate that courage. Maybe someone at dinner asked about the future. Maybe the conversation shifted toward relationships. Maybe the ex mentioned moving forward. Maybe they talked about what they want now, and perhaps your soulmate realized they cannot keep pretending they do not have desires of their own. They may want a relationship that feels peaceful. They may want someone who understands their dreams. They may want someone who challenges them in healthy ways. They may want someone who sees their imperfections and does not immediately walk away. They may want a connection where both people can grow. And perhaps they have been thinking about you because something about you represents that possibility. This is why the truth from last night may surprise you. The surprising part may not be that the ex appeared. The surprising part may be that the meeting helped your soulmate understand that they no longer want to go backward. The past may have looked familiar across the dinner table, but familiar did not feel the same. The old chemistry may have been replaced by perspective. The old emotions may have been replaced by understanding. And perhaps your soulmate left that dinner with a completely different mindset from the one they arrived with. Maybe they walked outside afterward. The night air was quiet. The streets were calmer. The conversation was over. But their thoughts were still moving. They may have looked at their phone. Maybe your name was there. Maybe they considered sending a message. Maybe they opened the conversation and closed it again. Maybe they typed something and erased it. Maybe they wondered whether it was too late. That moment is important, because people often hesitate right before they make an emotional breakthrough. The mind says, wait. The heart says, say something. The mind says, what if they reject you? the heart says, "What if you never try?" And somewhere between those two voices, a decision begins forming. Maybe your soulmate is there now. Maybe they are beginning to realize that silence does not protect them forever. Silence can preserve comfort, but silence can also preserve regret. Perhaps they do not want regret. Perhaps they want the opportunity to know what could happen if they finally become honest. And that is why this message is not about an ex, it is about closure. It is about contrast. It is about recognizing the difference between what once was and what may become. The ex may have been part of the journey, but the journey does not have to end where it began. You do not have to compete with someone's history. History is history. Your value is not measured against someone else's past. Your connection, if it becomes real, will be built on what happens between you now. That is where the future lives, not in old memories, not in imagined scenarios, not in fear, not in comparison. The future lives in choices, and perhaps your soulmate is beginning to make a different choice. Maybe they are choosing honesty, maybe they are choosing emotional maturity. Maybe they are choosing to stop pretending. Maybe they are choosing to heal. Maybe they are choosing to stop letting old experiences determine new possibilities. And if that happens, something beautiful can emerge, not because destiny forces two people together, but because two people willingly decide to meet each other with honesty. That is the kind of love worth building. The kind where neither P.E.